Today we are joined again by Neil Chatelain. Neil is the author of the newly released Treasure and Empire in the Civil War, which will be linked in the description below. When people think of the Civil War, they think of epic land battles like the Battle of Gettysburg. But the following conversation uncovers the untold story of the naval campaigns to seize control of the gold from the West. Controlling this gold meant having a bigger bank, which inevitably meant having a bigger stick. Enjoy the episode. So Neil, welcome back to American History Gazette.
Thank you. It's great to be back.
All right, now Treasure and Empire in the Civil War, the Panama Route, the West, and the campaigns to control America's mineral wealth. Quite an interesting story from the Civil War. So can you just tell me a little bit about what this book is about and why you wrote it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the book is focusing mainly on connecting a lot of the recent historiography over the last 20, 30 years about the Civil War in the far West and the Western territories, the Pacific coastline, and merging that with this concept of this Panama Route, which is the transportation network moving people back and forth from New York to California, and also the transportation network moving gold from California back to New York, all via the Panama Isthmus of Latin America. And so merging all these ideas together, we bring about this concept of campaigns waged during the Civil War to control the Western territories themselves, where all this mineral wealth is mined from, but also to control the transportation networks that all of this mineral wealth is being transported over. And so it's definitely a story about money and gold for sure, but it links a lot of disparate elements of the Civil War, the far West, the military, the Navy, economics, diplomacy, all kind of merged together.
Yeah, it's truly a fascinating story and pretty untold story in American Civil War history, I feel like. But your title, Treasure and Empire, treasure obviously is referring to the mineral wealth you mentioned. But how'd you come to this title? What exactly is empire? What empire are you talking about?
Yeah, so the treasure part is the obvious mineral wealth in the Western territories. The empire part's a little bit deeper than that. So obviously, before the Civil War, the United States is acquiring a lot of territory, the Mexican Cession, Oregon, Texas, and whatnot to achieve that coast-to-coast push. And so during the Civil War, the United States is moving to maintain an internal continental empire. And so they're going to wage combat not just against Confederate military forces, but there's going to be a lot of activity against indigenous populations across the American West and Southwest, especially during the Civil War. And so the U.S. is trying to maintain this continental empire during the war, and the Confederates are trying to advance armies to seize this continental empire. Arizona secedes and joins the Confederacy, which most people don't realize, and the Confederate Army is trying to get its way into California and to the Colorado River to get into Colorado itself. But then there's also another element of it, and that is Latin America. So the United States maintains this policy, the Monroe Doctrine, that it sets in the beginning of the 19th century, where we try to keep European nations from re-intervening in the Americas overall, from reintroducing colonies. And so a lot of the Monroe Doctrine goes to the wayside during the Civil War, and the naval elements of the U.S. Navy are intervening in Latin American waters to try to keep that Monroe Doctrine alive. And so we're also essentially trying to build our status as a continental power to ensure that continental hegemony, essentially, during the U.S. Civil War, even while fighting the Confederacy all at the same time.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the Monroe Doctrine this early. I have to ask, I'm reading a book right now, and historians are taking on, various narratives from American history and kind of challenging the status quo. But one of the topics is American imperialism, and I'm glad you brought up the Monroe Doctrine. I'd like to ask, do you think America in this case was being sort of hypocritical with the Monroe Doctrine? Because the Monroe Doctrine is basically telling European powers that they can't get involved over in the Americas, but America is getting involved in Latin American countries. So do you think there's some hypocrisy there?
Yeah, so there absolutely is hypocrisy in the United States policy as a whole. I mean, we're getting involved in nations all around our borders all through the 19th century. We're invading Mexico. We're intervening in Florida with Spain. We're doing these filibustering expeditions, which is not the U.S. government, but it's American citizens. And so there's a real issue there with the United States getting involved in Latin America. But it's not just Latin America. I mean, in the 1850s, the United States seizes a lot of unclaimed guano islands all across the Pacific Ocean and the Caribbean and so on. And so we definitely are building an empire. And it may not be a formal empire, so to speak, where we're calling things colonies, but we are dominating more land in North America. We're dominating more influence in Latin America. And this conflict, I mean, during the Civil War, Europe does re-intervene in the Americas. I mean, Mexico was invaded by France and Britain, and they installed the Habsburg Empire through the Mexican government by France. And Spain reintervenes and conquers Santo Domingo, and there's wars in South America. The Chincha Islands Wars begins in 1864. So Europe is reintervening, but for sure the United States is also claiming all of this land in its territorial sphere of influence, so to speak. So that we definitely have at least an informal push for empire, and that's one thing that I wanted to make sure was brought about in the book, so that people could understand that the Spanish-American War doesn't come out of nowhere, where we're claiming all these lands. They have a definite evolutionary process.
Right. Yeah, it's definitely an interesting debate around American imperialism. I know a lot of American leaders have claimed that America is not an empire, but when you look at history, it's an interesting debate to have. But you mentioned gold is so significant. I'd like to get into gold significance here, and especially when it comes to the Confederacy, their financial situation was dire because the Union, President Abraham Lincoln, they're obviously attacking the institution of slavery, which is so vital to the South's economy and really cripples them. So can you talk a little bit about the significance of gold and the South's economy and why they were so desperate to get their hands on some?
Yeah, so the Confederacy, when they form, is based off of this cash crop economic system of using enslaved labor to create cash crops to then sell and export to create finished products, textiles predominantly through cotton. Uh, so the Confederacy has significant wealth. The issue for them is that that wealth is tied into their land and into the system of enslaved labor, into people. And so they don't have as many factories. They don't have as much industrial capacity developed at that point in the 1860s, and they also don't have as much mineral wealth. And so their wealth is tied into land, which is being conquered during the war, and it's tied into slaves, which are being targeted in the war for emancipation. So a big reason Abraham Lincoln pushes for emancipation in the Civil War is so that it is used as a war measure to weaken the Confederacy. That's the justification he keeps giving. That's how the Emancipation Proclamation as an executive order is accomplished. It's a war measure to weaken the enemy, the Confederacy. And so they target systematically through the Confiscation Acts and through the Emancipation Proclamation the Confederacy's ability to wage war economically through that system of enslavement. And they're doing that because the Confederacy has no mineral wealth. So when the Civil War begins, the United States Treasury has $73 million in gold in its coffers. The Confederacy has a total treasury of $500,000 when the war begins. They have no money. They have no hard currency, and they need to use hard currency to buy weapons abroad, build ships abroad, get supplies abroad. You can't use credit. They have no paper money value, so they need to pay hard currency to actually get these things from overseas, and they have none. And so it's a real problem for the Confederacy, hence why when they realize that there are ships carrying gold, mysteriously those ships become a target for the Confederate Navy.
Yeah, I mentioned in my intro that whoever has the bigger treasury has the bigger stick, meaning guns, ships, things of that nature, obviously. And there's an interesting illustration in your book, a little political cartoon that I found pretty funny. And it was sort of this fight between Jefferson Davis and Abraham Lincoln, and they were fighting with these sacks or whatever. And the sacks represented their treasuries, their respective treasuries. And Abraham Lincoln had this big sack, and Jefferson Davis's was real tiny. And it kind of showed in comedic terms the disparities between their two treasuries. I thought that was a pretty interesting political cartoon that really showed kind of the dire financial situation of the Confederacy and the difference between the two. But the Confederacy realizes their need for physical currency, mineral wealth, gold, things of that nature. So what are their plans in terms of the West, which is producing all the gold, Nevada, California, Arizona? What are their plans and aspirations to get control of this gold?
There is an effort by the Confederacy to seize the lands where all of this mineral wealth is directly. In 1861, the southern half of modern-day New Mexico and Arizona, what is styled the Arizona Territory, secedes from the United States and joins the Confederacy as a territory. And when they do this, the Confederate government realizes this goes all the way to the Colorado River. And there are people as far as Tucson, Arizona, claiming they want to be part of this Confederacy. And so, a Confederate leader, Henry Sibley, goes to Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, and basically says, let me go try and capture all this land and I will make it happen. And so Jefferson Davis gives his blessing, and Sibley creates a small army in Texas and marches into Arizona. And in 1862, there's a series of campaigns and battles in Arizona where the Confederates seize Santa Fe, seize Albuquerque, seize the rest of New Mexico territory, and their goal is to then either march north into Colorado or march west into California, because there's gold in Colorado and there's gold in California, and to create this sort of Confederate expansionist empire continentally. And so they have these ambitions to seize this land directly. Now, the United States, of course, has a role to play in stopping that, and U.S. volunteers from Colorado, U.S. volunteers from California, and regular Army soldiers in New Mexico and Arizona who were left there when the war starts all sort of band together and do a big pincer movement to trap Sibley and get him kicked out of all this and sent back to Texas. So the Confederates do make a major effort to seize these western lands, but it does not develop into anything substantial.
So this plan to take the land in the West, they didn't get any gold from it. It just was an utter failure.
Yeah, so they did not have any gold developed. There were mines in New Mexico and Arizona, but they did not produce very much gold. There's much more copper in that area and so on. So they didn't get their hands on. There were not wagons full of gold being carried back to Texas, so to speak. It would have taken developments. Now, what's interesting is that later on in the war, the United States does discover gold in modern-day Arizona, the northwestern part, and they're going to eject all of the Navajo that live in that land and force them to relocate to another part of New Mexico in what becomes the Long Walk of the Navajo, which is essentially their equivalency of the Trail of Tears for that tribe. And so, and that then gets developed in for mining purposes after the war. So even during the conflict, they're making discoveries, and it's affecting peoples all across the area, indigenous peoples and Americans and Confederates all over.
Yeah, and this brings us to the Panama Route, which is sort of the Confederacy's Plan B. Now, the Panama Route was the largest gold transportation route in America at that time, and this is where the United States Navy, was transporting the gold from the West through the Panama Canal up to New York, and vice versa, transporting people to the West from New York and from other parts of the Union. So can you tell me about the Panama Route's significance and kind of the process of getting gold to and from the United States?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Panama Route it starts either in New York or San Francisco, California, and the middle section is the Panama Isthmus, modern-day nation of Panama, which before the Civil War is part of this nation called Nueva Granada, which later changes its name to the United States of Colombia. During the middle of our Civil War, they changed their name. And Panama, the modern-day nation state, is one territory, one state within that nation. And when the end of the Mexican-American War happens and we gain control of California and find this gold, what happens is everybody's trying to get to California, and there's a couple of ways to go. You can go by these overland trails, which can be very dangerous, things like the Oregon Trail, or you can go by boat, leaving New York, going to Panama, crossing across the Isthmus in a day or two by walking, and then taking another boat up to California. The Oregon Trail, the California Trail, those could take 4, 5, 6 months. The boat journey through Panama could take 4 weeks. And so it's a much faster and safer journey for people to transport. It just costs more money to do so. And Panama is not the only way. There's another route through Mexico. There's another route through Nicaragua. You can go around all of South America through Cape Horn if you needed to as well. But Panama's version becomes the most traveled version, so to speak. And when it becomes that reliable as a place, that's where all the gold is coming back, because everyone sees regular routes. I mean, these aren't just random ships going, I'll leave New York and get to Panama and then figure it out from there. Companies organize this. In the Atlantic Ocean, there's the Atlantic and Pacific Mail Company, and that's operated by Cornelius Vanderbilt of New York. And in the Pacific Ocean, it's the Pacific Mail Steamship Company, operated by Allen McLean and William H. Aspinwall, these big New York tycoons. And so it's very organized. The ships leave New York and San Francisco on the same day. They reach Panama on the same day, and it's very systematized, going up and down regularly. So everybody knows this journey, and so it becomes very easy to transport. And on these ships carrying gold back from California, it's very easy to have $1, $2, $3 million worth of gold. So, the Confederacy has a treasury of $500,000. Capturing one of these ships can double or triple their entire treasury.
Yeah, that's crazy. And it really shows you the political and diplomatic and economic aspects of this war as well. This wasn't just, the Confederacy and the Union fighting. There were a lot of economic and political third parties kind of heavily involved, like you mentioned, Vanderbilt. This really inevitably ties the war to foreign nations, because we're traveling through Mexico, we're traveling through Central America, South America. So I'm interested to know where their allegiances lied in this conflict, and also European nations, because I know a big issue for the Confederacy was international legitimacy abroad. They wanted to be recognized as a legitimate nation, especially in the European nations. So where did the Mexican, Central American, South American, European, where all their allegiances lie in terms of this conflict? Was the Confederacy garnering any legitimacy, or were they pretty much being disregarded?
So a big element of the Confederacy's strategy for the war is to gain international recognition, just like the United States tried to gain international recognition in its War of Independence with France. The Confederacy tries to do that as well. It does not work out. Many nations, England, the British, the French, Brazil, even Hawaii, all declare neutrality in this conflict, and they all grant the Confederacy belligerent rights, meaning they recognize it as an attempted nation state where they can actually try to get loans and try to get supplies abroad and try to start diplomatic relations, but they will never actually gain an official recognition from any nation state during the conflict at all. But they're trying this entire time. Now, European governments are very much in this for their own self-interest. The British and the French many people want to see a confederacy exist, because that means the United States is weaker. And if the United States is weaker, then that means that they can possibly re-intervene in America more, reestablish colonies, or try to gain influence elsewhere without American interference. So, many people are like, oh, the British are neutral, but they're also clandestinely supplying blockade runners. And they're also looking the other way when the Confederates arm warships in England. And France is kind of doing the same thing for most of the war as well. So they're very much they're on the fence, but they never do declare war, but they also do have their own sympathies overall. Mexico is very preoccupied during the war because they are in the midst of their own civil war. After we fought the war with Mexico in the 1850s, they're fighting a civil war amongst themselves, the War of the Reform. And then Benito Juarez seizes control, gains power in Mexico, and then the French and the British invade Mexico, and that results in like the Battle of Puebla, Cinco de Mayo, and then the French gain control of Mexico and install an Austrian Archduke as the Emperor of Mexico. Uh, the United States of Colombia is very much more in a pro-United States stance, and that's because the United States has shipping companies going to them every week. There's a railroad across the Isthmus of Panama, operated and owned by United States businessmen. So the United States has a vested interest in Panama and Colombia, and so they take a much more pro-U.S. stance. But the European governments are also trying to intervene in that system as well during the conflict. The U.S. recognizes Haiti in 1862, but we do that so we can set up a naval base there because of their kindness of us recognizing them, so that we can then use that as a U.S. naval base to then project power into the Caribbean to maintain this Panama route when it's threatened by the Confederate Navy ultimately. So the European countries, Latin American countries, they're taking sides, they are choosing sides, they are making influential diplomatic choices here. And in many ways, they're trying to play both sides of the fence where they can to gain a weaker United States, but also to not recognize the Confederacy officially until they don't need them to be recognized at this point. So they're playing both sides of this diplomatically as well.
Yeah, I think, especially from a European perspective, a Confederate victory kind of nullifies the Monroe Doctrine and invalidates any sort of strong arm the United States would have in curtailing the European ambition. So they're probably salivating at a Confederate victory because they can get their paws back on the Americas. But you mentioned there's a civil war going on in Mexico, all these kind of skirmishes throughout Central America. Did the Confederacy or the United States ever get involved in these? Were there ever any conflicts or battles that were fought with the Central Americans?
So in Central America, no. So when Spain reinvaded and recolonized Santo Domingo at the beginning of our Civil War, within a couple of years, many people in Spain were actually worried we were going to intervene militarily and try to force them to leave. We did not do that ultimately. In Mexico, in 1862, when Confederate armies were invading New Mexico and Arizona, Confederate diplomats are going into the northern states of Mexico, Chihuahua and Sonora, to try to gain diplomatic favors. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy is stationing their warships outside of principal Mexican ports, especially on the Pacific coastline in places like Mazatlan, and so that they can try to hint at the French, like, hey, maybe stay away or don't get involved in this port, so to speak. At some point, the U.S. Navy sends ships as far as French Polynesia and Hawaii, as far south as Argentina, all in an effort to try to show the U.S. flag and hint that this Monroe Doctrine is not going away, all while under the same pretense of they're searching for Confederate warships at the same time. So they're trying to get two birds with one stone with some of these wartime naval patrols.
That's interesting that there's two separate wars going on in such close proximity, and we're traveling through Central America and it's inevitably intertwined, but I find it kind of crazy that they never actually kind of collide and we kind of fight battles with Latin America. It's pretty interesting. But we have this Panama route, the United States, the Union, they're transporting gold and people back and forth through this Panama route. So after their unsuccessful attempt, the Confederates' unsuccessful attempt to seize the West by land, they resort to by sea and using their navy. So what was their plan to attack these transports, and what types of methods did they deploy to challenge the route and kind of intercept these gold shipments?
Yes, so the Confederate Navy, there's never actually a national naval strategy to intercept the Panama Route's steamers, the transportation ships. But what develops very quickly is that there is a policy that does develop. It's just an informal one. So at the beginning of the Civil War, even in April 1861, there are newspaper articles in New York that say, the ships are carrying $1 million in gold and they have no weapons on them. Maybe we should do something to protect these because the Confederates just announced they're doing privateers and stuff. There is talk all through the beginning of the war, the first year of the war, that Confederate privateers are going to materialize out of somewhere and just seize these ships full of money. And what happens is that the Confederacy's commerce raiders, the ships that go out onto the ocean to sink U.S. merchant vessels, they systematically target the Panama Route ships. And it's not just an ad hoc thing. The Confederate Navy is going to have its European squadron commander, because they do send an officer to Europe to act as the commander of naval forces in Europe for the Confederacy. He issues orders to every commerce raider, every Confederate warship built in Europe, that they should target the Panama Route, that they should target what he calls the California steamers bringing money from California. And so CSS Alabama, the most famous Confederate warship, does this. CSS Florida targets this. CSS Shenandoah targets these. CSS Rappahannock has orders to target these. CSS Georgia has orders to target these. CSS Stonewall, the Confederacy's only ironclad built abroad, has orders to target these ships. And they do. There's a 6-month period in the middle of the war where the Confederacy's naval activity is most spirited in targeting the Panama Route. In December 1862, the Confederate commerce raider Alabama captures one of these ships. The problem for them is that they're capturing one of the ships while it's on its way to get gold from Panama, not on its way from Panama full of gold. And so they let it go because it's packed with 1,000 passengers, including actually about 150 U.S. Marines who were on their way to be transported to the Pacific Ocean to augment the Pacific Ocean's naval squadron. So they're actually captured. A couple months later, in February 1863, a Confederate privateer is capturing ships along this Panama Route. And so that's causing more angst. March 1863, a group of Confederate sympathizers in San Francisco Harbor try to escape San Francisco Harbor on a privateer to then attack the Panama Route ships in the Pacific Ocean. And good U.S. intelligence, and then they convince one of the members of this Confederate plot to switch sides, essentially, and to defect. They end up being captured before they go anywhere. And then in June 1863, so 6 months after CSS Alabama captured that first treasure ship, CSS Florida captures a clipper ship packed with $100,000 in silver. And then they bring that silver to Bermuda, and then bring it to England, and then bring it to France. And they try to launder the silver by melting it down so it can't be traced by anywhere. French courts intervene, the British sue, they get all this money back, and so the Confederates never get anything from it. But so for 6 months, everything in the news seems to be Confederates are targeting this Panama Route, and everybody involved in the Panama Route, the shipping managers, the tycoons in New York, they go crazy about this, and they start demanding the government provide actual protection. Now, towards the end of the war, the Confederates also send a team of people to Panama itself to try to disguise themselves as passengers, and then they essentially try to board one of these ships carrying gold disguised as a passenger group. But U.S. naval intelligence, diplomatic intelligence, the consuls and ambassadors all intervene, and these Confederates are captured as well. And so the Confederate, they try a lot of things. They try privateers, they try conventional warships, they try what could be equivalent to like special operations today, and none of it ultimately does work to a point where they're actually bringing substantial amounts of gold anywhere. But it does cause a really big shock within the United States government and shipping leaders across the nation who demand action be taken.
So the Confederacy does ultimately see some early successes with some ship captures, but they don't see any gold, you said?
Essentially, no. So we're talking about a few $1,000s, essentially, nothing substantial enough to be useful in a real capacity to change the course of the war.
Last episode, I had on Eric J. Dolan, and we talked about his book, Black Flags, Blue Waters, which was about the history of piracy in America. And I think it would be such a fascinating kind of alternate history here with this gold being shipped through the Panama Route if the golden age of piracy kind of took place during this time. People like Jack Sparrow, I'm sure probably would have found a haven here with all this gold transport, because there was privateers from the Confederacy. It would be interesting to see how piracy kind of played out with all of this gold being transported. Were there any instances of piracy here?
No, there's not any instances of piracy. A couple of times, so the U.S. government used these ships carrying gold to transport soldiers and sailors back and forth from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic, and from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And there is one case in 1864 of some of those U.S. Navy sailors on one of these ships mutinying to try to seize control of the ship. But the ship's captain and its crew and the U.S. Navy's officers on that ship as being transported essentially killed 3 U.S. sailors to stop this mutiny. So that's probably the closest you're going to get to like a pirate story, so to speak. But the rest of it is privateers, which are, licensed under their letter of marque and reprisal, and then these Confederate commerce raiders, which, of course, the U.S. government kept saying, and anecdotally, those are pirates, even though legally speaking, through all of these international recognitions of belligerent status, that they're not in a pirate situation, and they're not put on trial for piracy when they're captured. So there's a lot there.
I think there's a pretty good movie in here somewhere that can be dramatized with piracy. I would love to see that play out someday. Maybe you should work with a screenwriter. But the Confederate Navy, like you mentioned, captures some ships. They send a shock into the Union, scares them, and the Union and third parties with economic interest, they're like, we got to arm these ships because they aren't armed. So after this initial Confederate success, what steps does the Union take to counter this attack?
Yes, so at the beginning of the war, all of these shipping leaders demanded the U.S. Navy provide a tangible protection, as in like a naval convoy escorting these ships from one place to the next. But at the beginning of the war, the U.S. Navy doesn't have the manpower or ships to do so. And instead, what the U.S. government does is it offers surplus arms, weapons, and cannons to arm these ships. They offer to commission the captains of these merchant transports as officers in the U.S. Navy to guarantee some legal protections. But what we essentially see happening is that these are civilian ships that are armed merchant steamers now. And that's something that we see later on in World War I. That's something we're even seeing discussed now in the Red Sea with all of the Houthi attacks going on. But what ultimately happens is that they do get armed, but they're armed very haphazardly, just a few dozen weapons, a few dozen rifles, 1 or 2 cannons, and they don't have sailors that are trained to operate these things. In fact, when CSS Alabama captures the one ship named Ariel in 1862, they actually bring back the cannon that Ariel had on it and use that for the rest of the ship's lifespan for the Confederates to advantage. But after these ships get captured and after the Confederates make this threat in 1862 and early 1863, the shipping leaders basically say, enough is enough. We need actual tangible protection, and the U.S. Navy begins a system of convoys. At first, these convoys are set up in the Windward Passage between Cuba and Haiti, which is where the Confederate ships captured the one ship Ariel, and it's the choke point for this entire journey from New York to Panama and back. And so the U.S. Navy begins escorting ships through this Windward Passage. They establish a squadron, the West India Squadron, whose goal is to hunt down Confederate raiders and then escort these treasure convoys through the Windward Passage. In 1864, those convoys are expanded to cover from New York all the way to the Panama Isthmus and back. So it's a full Atlantic convoy happening, akin to what's going on during like World War I or World War II. And so these early convoys, the closest thing that you can resemble them to is like Operation Earnest Will through the Straits of Hormuz in the 1980s, or what's going on today in the Red Sea as vessels are being escorted by the U.S. Navy through the Bab el-Mandeb Straits into the Red Sea and into the Gulf of Aden, so to speak. So there are some tangential connections to similar things happening today. But so this is the first time that the U.S. Navy takes a sustained system of convoys in its history. And by sustained, what I mean is that 87 full convoys are made during this war. 87 convoys are done. Some of those are partial through the Windward Passage, some of those are the full route across the entire Atlantic seaboard. But we're not talking about just a couple of trips here. We're talking about dozens and dozens of regularly scheduled trips. So it's a real task for the U.S. Navy, but the payoff is legitimate because they're escorting millions and millions and millions of dollars safely to New York, and that's going straight into the New York Stock Exchange and supporting the war effort directly.
Yeah, this was really a revolutionary tactic from the U.S. Navy to send out convoys and escorts. Like you said, this had never really been done before, and it's still going on today, so it shows you the effectiveness. Because at first they were kind of just sending aid in a way to these merchant vessels and steamers to kind of stimulate and fortify them so they were less prone to attack. But they ultimately realized that the actual U.S. Navy was going to have to get involved and send out ships. Did this impact the war going on in mainland America, the mainland United States at that time? Because the navies at this time, they're still relatively small, and I can imagine sending all of these ships to escort down through the Panama Canal would kind of stretch their resources thin. So did this impact the war going on in mainland America in any way?
In the beginning of the war, not as much. But as the war reaches around the midpoint, 1863, the U.S. Navy is now the largest navy on Earth because they have built enough ships. And so they have the capacity to do this. Now, it's not a case of the U.S. Navy successfully completing these escort missions impacts the war. What it is it's preventing the Confederates from impacting the war in a substantial way. Because if the Confederates can seize a few of these ships and get $5 or $10 million in gold, they can buy a fleet of ironclad warships in Europe, or they can buy an entire weapon supply system for an entire field army in Europe and bring it over in one shot. And so you're talking about a substantial amount of money that could impact the Confederacy's war effort in a major way. Instead, what we see is that the Confederates don't get any of this gold, and instead their economy collapses because when you combine the Emancipation Proclamation and many enslaved laborers self-liberating themselves and escaping to freedom during the war, 500,000 enslaved laborers will do that during the war, plus the fact that the Confederates are losing plantations, they're losing land being confiscated or just conquered in the war. They have no money, and the paper money the Confederates are printing is becoming worthless. So, and meanwhile, the U.S. government's inflation rate is stabilized largely because there's a continuous flow of gold into the U.S. economy. So some statistics here is at the beginning of the war, the U.S. dollar, the Confederate dollar, each one can buy $1's worth of gold. So a $1 gold dollar you only need to pay $1 in paper money for. By the time Abraham Lincoln gets reelected in 1864, November 1864, it cost an American in the United States $2.33 in paper money to buy $1 in gold. That's still a lot of inflation. That's, it's 2 times the inflation in just a couple of years. But compare that to the Confederates. That same month, they would need $33 to buy $1 in gold. And so the Confederate economy falls apart completely. It collapses thanks to the U.S. Navy's blockade, and because they don't have the mineral wealth to sustain themselves. Meanwhile, the U.S. government does have a sustained economy, and this gold is helping to keep that inflation tangible so that it is something that the U.S. economy can withstand and maintain its war effort continuously. And so it's not like a particular battle is won because gold bars show up all of a sudden. It's not the case at all. But what it is New York business leaders, New York bankers, the New York business elite, these tycoons are funding the war. They're the ones buying most of the war bonds. They're the ones who are operating the factories producing the war material. And if they don't want to pay for any of that anymore because they're losing money because their gold's not getting there from California, they can withdraw their support from the war, and then it becomes a whole lot more difficult to arm the U.S. military. And so there are a lot of intangibles that overall result in a net gain for the United States in a stable economy that is sustaining this war effort, while the Confederate economy collapses and they're not able to get the war material they need in such quantities. By the end of the war, their economy just collapses.
Yeah, I think that really shows the disparity in the industrial might between the United States and the Confederacy. The United States is able to pump out all these ships, and like you said, by the end of the war, they have the largest navy in the world, which is incredible. It shows you the industrial might, but it seems that they kind of took on more of a defensive position, and they would rather protect the cargo and the gold, which was so vital to the war effort, as opposed to using those ships for offensive attack, which ultimately was a brilliant strategy that played out very well. And it really just choked the Confederacy. I mean, in our last episode, last time we sat down, we talked about the Mississippi River campaigns and how that cut off the supply lines. And then you have, you know, them cutting off the Confederacy by the Panama Route and them not being able to get any gold. So it really just squeezes the Confederacy dry of funds. And like you mentioned, their economy just collapses. So when exactly in the war time period does their economy collapse, and how does this just ultimately lead to their downfall?
Yeah, it's a continuous process throughout the entire conflict. So the U.S. military's strategy to win this war, that it's colloquially called the Anaconda Plan. Part one of that is blockade Confederate ports with warships so they can't get supplies. Part two is cut the Mississippi River in half so the Confederacy is split and isolated. And then part three is invade all of these subdivided elements and destroy the Confederacy, what's left of it, bit by bit. So the blockade does take a long time to work, but it does choke the Confederacy of supplies. The United States Navy and the United States Army seize critical ports or close critical ports. New Orleans is captured in 1862. Mobile Bay is captured in 1864. Wilmington, North Carolina is captured in 1865. Charleston is blockaded effectively in 1863. Savannah, Georgia is blockaded effectively in 1862. And so this means that the fewer ports the Confederates have, the fewer supplies they can receive abroad. And yeah, the Confederacy isn't literally starving. Yeah, there are food shortages, but it's because their rail networks are collapsing. They can sustain enough food production within their borders. And the Confederacy tries to build up an infrastructure of industrial capacity through building more factories. The problem is that they need even more than what they're producing. And so, there was never a case where the Confederates sent soldiers into battle without guns. They were always able to find firearms and so on. But were they the best quality? Were they all the top of the line, or were they older relics from a different period is a different question. And so the Confederacy is stripped of these supplies slowly over the course of the war. Now, the gold comes into a factor because if they can get all that gold to Europe, they can purchase supplies and they can purchase essentially warships to escort all those supplies and break the U.S. blockade, bring in 100,000 guns in one trip or something along those lines. And then that can make a real difference because all of a sudden, all the Confederate armies have brand new weapons with the latest technology, and they're able to go toe for toe, and that might cause a real problem. So it's not really until the end of the war, late 1864, where the Confederacy's infrastructure begins to completely collapse, and that's because the Anaconda Plan has worked. They're blockaded. The Mississippi River is cut in half, and so the Confederacy is split. And then those interior ports, Atlanta is captured in mid-1864, the March to the Sea by William Tecumseh Sherman and so on. They're destroying the Confederacy's transportation networks, and the last few ports are blocked up and taken. And so everything kind of just really falls apart in this January, February, March, April 1865 time period when there are no ports left and there are no railroads left and there's nobody left to fight with. And so they're running out of soldiers, they're running out of material. And so it brings about an ultimate conclusion.
Yeah, the Anaconda Plan worked brilliantly, and what a poetic name for this plan. Really represents their goal, and they get squeezed dry. As we know, the Confederacy loses, they surrender. But by the end of the war, how much gold and mineral wealth had been transported through the Panama Route by the United States?
Yeah, so I have the statistics here. The so 151 trips were made on the Panama route during the Civil War by these ships carrying wealth. And in those 151 trips, they're going to transport $198 million in gold. That's the equivalent today to about $6 billion in gold, but it's even more if you think about it. Um, the amount of gold transported from California to New York during the Civil War, if we equate the amount, just the total dollar amount and the physical number, that would make just that amount of gold probably like the 10th or 15th wealthiest nation on earth today. Just the Civil War's gold on its own. So we're talking about not just like, oh, $100 million, $200 million doesn't seem like a lot of money today. And even when you convert it to modern dollars, $6 billion is a lot of money, but in the grand scheme of, U.S. budgets of $1 trillion, not so much. But here's the sticking point. $200 million in gold was transported across during the Civil War. The U.S. national budget in 1860 was only $60 million. And so you're talking about a significant amount. The U.S. national treasury in 1861 was only $72 million. And so you're talking about transporting 3 times the national treasury on this Panama route, or 3 or 4 times the national budget of the United States along this Panama route. And so it's a significant amount of wealth, hence why it was a target and hence why it was ultimately protected, because we're talking about a substantial amount of money.
Yeah, that's insane. That is a lot of money. How do you think the war would have played out differently? Let's get into a little alternate history here. How do you think the war would have played out if the Confederacy was able to say, maybe get even 10% of that gold?
Yeah, so it's difficult to note this. What would happen is that if the Confederates started capturing 1 or 2 of these ships, they would have just stopped transporting the gold and would have just stayed in California. So realistically, the most the Confederates would have gotten is 2 or 3, 4 of these ships, $5 or $10 million in gold total. And that's still $10 million is still about 5% of the total that was carried during the war. But with about $10 million in gold, what you have for the Confederates is the ability to buy a fleet outright of ironclad warships in Europe and buy a squadron of transports outright full of weapons. And they could then use those ironclads to break the blockade and then to help arm their armies better. And that could create actually a diplomatic victory to the point where if they break the blockade at the right time in the war, and then a couple of battlefield victories are won right after that using these weapons, you could theoretically convince England and France to possibly intervene and declare the Confederacy a legitimate nation. Realistically, that's the goal that they're trying to do, is to get diplomatic recognition. And that's probably the best way, because you're essentially bribing the European governments. Here's $10 million, give us some guns, we'll go win some battlefield victories, and we'll prove that we can win. And after we prove it, then you can say, oh, we were with you the whole time. And so realistically, that's the only way that could result in an ultimate Confederate victory, so to speak. But even then, it's a long shot because it depends on what year you're talking about. Britain is much more sympathetic to the Confederacy in 1861 than it is in 1864, for example. And so timing is also very crucial in this situation. So there's a lot of variables there, but there are some knowns that you can add to that intangible equation to try to get a better picture overall.
My follow-up question to that would be, the Confederacy is able to use those funds to get better weapons, more ships, better ships, more ironclads, but stopping the transportation of gold from the West would inevitably impact the Union from a financial aspect as well, because they're not getting that flow of gold. So how do you think, on top of the Confederacy being able to purchase some arms, how do you think that would have impacted the Union's war effort, not having access to those funds, maybe affecting their inflation a lot worse like it did the Confederacy?
Yeah, so There's a couple of options there. One would be they would just start transporting the gold overland, which would be more dangerous because of bandit attacks, or they're going through unknown lands or through mountain passes. It takes longer. Um, a realistic thing is that they just keep all the gold in San Francisco and protect it until the end of the war. But then what you might realistically have happen is that some of those war manufacturers in Pittsburgh or in New York or in Philadelphia or Boston that are making the cannons and building the ships, well, if they're not getting paid by the government in hard currency, or if the US dollar is devaluing because gold is not flowing into the economy as much, what they you could see is hyperinflation in some northern areas, or you could see a withdrawal of support where some shipbuilders are saying, I'm just not going to seek out government contracts because it's not cost effective, and I will build my ships for Denmark instead, or something like that. And worst case scenario is that what you would see is that the U.S. government would ultimately seize and nationalize all of these industries so that they would keep the war going with or without the permission of everything. And that's what happens to the U.S. economy in World War One. The U.S. government nationalizes the economy. And that's what happens to like the U.S. telegraph system in the Civil War is it's nationalized, and some of the railroad networks are nationalized, and they're just told you will do this and we will pay you, but you will do it no matter what we say. Um, and so you could see a greater nationalization of the U.S. industry, much like the Confederacy had a much larger nationalization because as the war ground on, they became more desperate. They became a very intrusive national government by the end of the Civil War, the Confederates did, to keep their nation alive. And so you could see the U.S. government doing a similar standpoint if they became desperate enough.
Wow, that's so interesting. It would be so fascinating to see how that alternate history would have played out had the Confederacy been more successful with their seizures in gold. I think that's almost as important a question as, what if the South won the Civil War? I know that's a pretty famous one. But looking kind of in the grand scheme of things, post-Civil War, Reconstruction, how did all this gold stimulate the economy of the United States and help post-war recovery?
Yeah, so the U.S. economy is booming at the end of the Civil War. There's an old saying that like war brings a good economy, and that like World War II ended the Great Depression, for example. The U.S. economy is booming now. The Southern economy, the former Confederacy at the end of the war, is distraught. It's collapsed completely and has to be rebuilt. But Northern industry is booming by the end of the war, and that's going to help spark within 10 years the second wave of the Industrial Revolution, where we start seeing folks like George Westinghouse and Thomas Edison and all of them trying to create and invent, and then we start seeing all of those robber barons like Rockefeller and everybody in the 1880s. The success of the U.S. industry in the Civil War helps spark all of that because a strong U.S. economy continues into the period of Reconstruction to the point where when Reconstruction ends in the 1870s, everyone just kind of like looks up to the north and, oh my goodness, the Industrial Revolution has gone into overdrive mode. Well, it's been doing that the whole time. It's just a matter of now people are paying attention to it instead of a military occupation of the Confederacy. And so there is a major industrial boom in the United States, largely because of this conflict. And this gold is helping to keep that wartime economy stabilized, which helps fosters some of that industrial growth through the war and then immediately afterwards.
Yeah, war definitely has a way of kicking economies into high gear. We see that here. We definitely saw that after World War II. I think that economic churn that we see in war always kind of carries over into peacetime. I know we saw the huge boom after World War II, and we definitely see that here. But did the Confederacy ultimately end up seeing some of that gold in the form of aid during Reconstruction? Because immediately following the Civil War, the main objective was to get the South back on their feet because they were just desolated. Their infrastructure was destroyed, their economy was destroyed, and the Union the Union and the Confederacy, well, no longer the Confederacy, but they shake hands after the war and they're like, all right, time to get back together. Let's unite. Let's get you guys back on your feet. So in the grand scheme of things, did they kind of see some of that gold after the war in the form of aid?
It's tricky because all the gold being transported on the Panama Route, none of it is actually U.S. government gold. It's all gold owned by civilians, third party businessmen, and whatnot. So, is the U.S. government providing aid to the South during Reconstruction? Absolutely, because of things like the Freedmen's Bureau being a U.S. military operation and so on. So there is a significant amount of aid processed into the South at the end of the war, just like the U.S. government is giving away land in the Western territories through the Homestead Act after the war. So there is a major push by the United States to try to reinvigorate the economy of the shattered southern United States. And elements of that is loans from New York business leaders and banks. And how are they able to give those loans? It's because those business leaders have the industrial capacity and have the wealth stockpiled so that they have the capital to provide these loans. And so in an indirect way, yeah, you can say that Southerners are going to eventually benefit from some of that wealth in the grand scheme of things through the rebuilding process, but it's not like anybody's walking around going, here's your cart of gold, who wants a chunk of gold? And it's not anything like that. And it's not the U.S. government just like throwing gold coins to people as they walk by. It's nothing in that situation at all. But there is, direct aid to freed people at the end of the war when slavery dies. And there is a rebuilding of the infrastructure of the South over time, partially through government aid, but partially through industrialists trying to help finance everything.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I can see how this kind of sowed the seeds for that robber baron era. Like you mentioned, the gold's kind of in the hands of the civilians, not in the government, and capitalism doing its thing. But that wraps up our conversation. Neil, I want to thank you so much for coming on again. This was such an insightful conversation. You're always very knowledgeable. You always have plenty to offer. It's such a cool story. Very much so a lesser known story from the Civil War. So I'm glad you wrote this book. I'm glad you could come on and talk about it. Neil, thank you.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure to be here. I'm happy to come back anytime. I'm always for it.
All right. And you guys can check out Neil's book, Treasure and Empire in the Civil War, in the link in the description. Highly urge you guys to check it out. It's very fascinating, full of illustrations to give you a sense of what was going on.